Okay, well, let's jump into lesson 61 in the Old Testament for grown-ups. I feel like we started this about 61 years ago, but lesson 61 in Old Testament for grown-ups. 1 Kings, we introduced 1 Kings last week. Of course, Kings in the Hebrew Bible is one book. It's divided in two books in our Bible. And it's connected with 1st and 2nd Samuel. So you can really take Samuel and Kings and it forms one history of the kings of Israel. And of course, 1 Kings begins here with David as an old man. He's on his deathbed. And his son Solomon, as we will see, will take over the throne. Solomon will experience great success. Solomon will experience great prosperity, and the kingdom will be established firmly. All of what we started way back in Genesis with God's call to one man named Abram. Everything that God has promised them, Israel has begun to see and will fully see in Solomon. However, it will not last. For even Solomon's life that begins so well does not end so well. And the united kingdom that they have in Israel will divide, and there will be turmoil and fighting and civil war, and ultimately, because of Israel's sin, they will be carried off into captivity. So before we get to some of the bad stuff, we'll relish in the good stuff that Israel has here in the beginning of 1 Kings. Today we'll kind of introduce the first 11 chapters, because that's kind of a big section in itself, and then we will dive into the first 5 chapters as the beginning of Solomon's reign. And then next week we will talk about Solomon's temple. We'll talk about Solomon's temple. So the first thing I have here is an outline, what's known as a Chaistic Outline, and what it does is it is comparing what's going on in parallel form. This Chaistic Outline goes through the first 11 chapters of the book of 1 Kings. So I want to just point this out because this is a literary form when the book of Kings was put together, and it's interesting to see it when you see it this way. So this gives us, first of all, an overview of the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings. And it also shows us the form in which it has been communicated to us. So if you look in letter A at the very top, a prophet intervenes in the royal succession between David and Solomon. If you look at the bottom A, we have a prophet determines the royal succession going forward after Solomon. If you look at the letter B at the top, Solomon eliminates threats to his security. So Solomon eliminates threats. If you look at B at the bottom, the Lord raises up threats to Solomon's security. So in the first part, everything is going good. In the second part, things begin to decline. Letter C, we have early promise of Solomon's reign. So Solomon's reign begins with a lot of promise. If you notice the bottom C, there is tragic failures to Solomon's reign. If you notice D at the top, Solomon uses wisdom for people. But if you notice D at the bottom, Solomon uses wisdom for himself. And Solomon's wisdom turns into folly. If you notice E at the top, preparations for building the temple, he prepares. E at the bottom, Solomon dedicates the temple, but is ultimately warned by God. F, Solomon begins building the temple. F at the bottom, Solomon completes building the temple. And then right in the middle, Solomon builds, quote, rival buildings, as Solomon would give in to the worship of his wives to worship other gods. So you can see how Solomon begins well, but there's a slow decline. Just as David began well, but there was actually a pretty quick decline in David's life. So that just gives us an overview of what you see in this first section of 1 Kings, of this overview of Solomon's reign, which begins well. And certainly Solomon building the temple is the highlight of Solomon's reign, which we'll see next week. But then we see through Solomon's folly, because all humans are, none of us are perfect, we're all prone to failure, Solomon's wisdom turns to folly. So let's jump into what's going on here, and specifically the first 5 chapters. We're going to take the first part of Solomon's reign and look at this. As we begin in 1 Kings chapter 1, David is still with us. However, David, now we jump forward in time when David is very old, and essentially David is on his deathbed. And because David is on his deathbed, and there has been no public announcement of David's successor, the kingdom is in crisis. It's very interesting that this comes, as we mentioned last week, as we were watching England and how their monarchy works. And they had a very successful succession between Queen Elizabeth II and her son. So the moment she died, he automatically becomes king. There is a successor. Well, there has been no public, even though Solomon is alluded to in Samuel, obviously there's been no public succession plan from David. We find out David has promised Bathsheba that Solomon would rule, but Solomon is not David's eldest living son. There is another one. And so he is going to assume the throne. And so as we find David on his deathbed, we find the kingdom is in crisis in chapter 1 of Kings. So if we notice on our paper under chapter 1, David's second-born son, Adonijah, he's actually David's 4th oldest son, but the 3 previous sons have died. So David's Adonijah revolts and tries to seize the throne. He tries to seize the throne. Adonijah is the heir apparent, but David had promised Solomon the throne through Bathsheba. To legitimize his takeover, Adonijah turns to his father's trusted general and priest to get his father's commanding general and priest to side with him. And he invites his other royal brothers to a secret coronation. So there's a lot of drama going on here. But Solomon's mother, Bathsheba, persuades David to force Solomon's coronation early. David gives Solomon his royal donkey and crowns him king in Jerusalem. Solomon is anointed with oil by a priest loyal to the royal family. Adonijah is in the middle of his feast when he learns his coup has already failed. So if you notice in chapter 1, let's read a couple of verses here in chapter 1. Of course, chapter 1 of 1 Kings begin when David is very old. And he's on his deathbed, and he could not keep warm. And so the attendants that are attending to David, obviously with David's past, they may know something about David. They said, let us get a young woman, let us get a young virgin to lay with David to keep him warm. If all these blankets won't work, we know a young woman will keep David warm. So they go and they search for a beautiful young woman whose name is Abishag. She's a Shunammite woman, and she'll come back up in a little bit, as we'll read. So she's brought to the king. She's very beautiful. She took care of the king and waited on him. They had, and it did add in here, they had no sexual relations. So that's how we begin, with David on his deathbed being warmed by a Shunammite woman. Now we have Adonijah, who puts himself forward, and he says in verse number 5, I will be king. So he gets chariots and horses ready with 50 men to run ahead of him. His father had never rebuked him by asking, "Why do you behave as you do?" He was also very handsome. He was born after Absalom. Adonijah conferred with Joab and with Abiathar the priest. Now Joab was David's commanding officer of his army, but they give their support to Adonijah. But Zadok the priest, Benaniah, Nathan the prophet, Shimei and Rai, David's special guards, did not join Adonijah. So Adonijah is assuming the role of a king, and he's putting together an army, he's putting together a commander, he's got him a priest. So he's basically assuming the position of king before David even dies. Well, word gets back to Nathan the prophet. Remember, Nathan was the one that confronted David against his sin about Bathsheba. But now Nathan and Bathsheba are concerned about what is going on. So Nathan comes to Bathsheba, who is Solomon's mother, and he says in verse number 11, "Have you not heard that Adonijah has become king, and our Lord David knows nothing about it? Now then, let me advise you on how you can save your own life and the life of your son Solomon. Go in to King David and say to him, 'My lord the king, did you not swear to me, your servant, surely Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne? Why then has Adonijah become king? While you are still there talking to the king, I will come in and add my word to what you have said.' So Bathsheba went to see the aged king in his room." So Bathsheba goes in and sees David following her. Nathan then comes in, and basically they come up with a plan to go ahead and make Solomon your heir. Go ahead and anoint him king so that he will succeed you, so this rebellion won't happen. Because again, at the heart of this is the question, what's going to happen to God's covenant? And obviously God's covenant alluded to Solomon. So Nathan knows this. Nathan knows that Solomon should succeed David, because Solomon was the one who God had anointed to build the temple, to carry on the covenant and to fulfill the covenant. So Adonijah being king would thwart God's covenant. And Nathan knows this. So he goes to Bathsheba, and then they confront David. So David then makes Solomon king. If you go down to chapter 1, verse number 29, chapter 1, verse 29, "The king took an oath, 'As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, I shall surely carry out this very day what I swore to you by the Lord God of Israel. Solomon your son will be king after me, and he will sit on my throne in my place.'" So he calls in Zadok the priest, he calls in Nathan the prophet, and he says in verse number 33, "Take your Lord's servant with you, and have Solomon my son mount my own mule, and take him down to Gihon. There have Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him king over Israel. Blow the trumpet and shout, 'Long live King Solomon.' Then you are to go up with him, and he is to come and to sit on my throne and reign in my place. I have appointed him ruler over Israel and Judah." So Solomon is now anointed king. That happens. Well, obviously, word goes back to Adonijah. And Adonijah, urged to do something about it, is fearful of Solomon. Fearful of Solomon. So Adonijah basically comes and bows down before King Solomon. And Solomon spares his life. Then as we go into chapter 2, Solomon establishes the kingdom. As we come to chapter 2, David, at the point of death, gives a charge to Solomon. And so chapter 2, verse 1 says this: "When the time drew near for David to die, he gave charge to Solomon his son." And here's the charge. Basically, be faithful to Yahweh. That's the charge. Be faithful to Yahweh. So here's what he says in verse number 2 of chapter 2. I am about to go the way of all the earth. He said, so be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him, keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me. If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. So that's David's charge to Solomon. And it echoes Deuteronomy in keeping the statutes, keeping the decrees, the laws, and the regulations. It echoes Joshua. Remember what God told Joshua, be strong and very courageous. Walk in my ways and in my laws. So David echoes that. The first thing he says is to be strong. He says to do this that you may prosper in all that you do. That's what God tells Joshua as well. So what you're going to find here in these chapters, especially in the chapters about the prosperity, is we have these allusions back to Deuteronomy, back to Moses, back to Abraham, back to Joshua, showing that what Solomon is doing here is a fulfillment of everything God promised the patriarchs, what he promised the fathers, what he promised Israel, what he promised them through the law. This is a fulfillment. So God is still working. After this charge to Solomon, David encourages him to, quote, my quote, tie up some loose ends. Tie up some loose ends. Basically to eliminate some threats that may come, or to extract justice, might be a better term, on people who justice has not been extracted. One of these is on Joab, from what Joab did. So on our paper, if you notice under chapter 2, David's final words. David's final words to Solomon also include unfinished business from his reign. Joab, his general, committed murder, but was never convicted. Shimei, a loyalist to Saul, slandered and attempted to stone David, but was never brought to justice. So David is telling Solomon to tie up these loose ends, extract justice upon Joab and Shimei. And then there's Barzillai, had not yet been honored for his loyalty to David during Absalom's rebellion. So David wants Solomon to tie up these loose ends, these loose threads, and start his reign with a clean slate. So a blessing to Barzillai, and then justice to Joab and Shimei. And that's basically what happens as Solomon establishes his throne. Along with Joab, along with Shimei, Solomon removes Abiathar from the priesthood, so he strips him of his priesthood, and Adonijah is put to death because possibly attempting to get back into the throne, Adonijah comes to Bathsheba, and he asked to marry the young virgin that they had put in the bed with David at chapter 1. So in chapter 2, verses 13 through 23, we have that story where Adonijah comes to Bathsheba and asks for Abishag the Shunammite to be his wife. And she wants Bathsheba to go to Solomon to fulfill this request. So when Bathsheba goes to Solomon and asks for Abishag the Shunammite to marry Adonijah, this infuriates Solomon. He said, well, you might as well just ask me for the kingdom and to give it to him. And he says, absolutely not. So because of this, death penalty for his half-brother, Adonijah. So Adonijah is put to death, Abiathar the priest is stripped from the priesthood. Joab is killed. Shimei is killed and struck down. And then if you notice at the end of chapter 2, the very last sentence of chapter 2 says the kingdom was now established in Solomon's hands. So in chapter 2, David gives his final charge to be faithful, his political charge to tie up some loose ends. Oh, and in the midst of this, David dies. In verse number 10 of chapter 2, David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. He had reigned for 40 years over Israel, 7 in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. And so chapter 2 is Solomon establishes his kingdom. The threats to his throne are taken care of. Justice has been extracted. And now Solomon will be blessed in his kingdom. So that takes us to chapters 3 through 5. And 3 through 5, we are told of Solomon's exploits and his blessings as king. So chapters 3 through 11, if you notice on the back of your page, chapters 3 through 11 describe the magnificent reign of Solomon. Which again, we're keeping some things in perspective. Here's a couple of things we're keeping in perspective. With the reign of Solomon, the promise to Abraham of a vast population has been fulfilled. Has been fulfilled. And number 2, with the construction of the temple, the Exodus that began all the way back in Exodus is now completed, as Yahweh gets his permanent dwelling place in Jerusalem. So what started out, and this is the story and the journey we've been on, 60 weeks, is what started out as God's calling to one man, Abram, made a family, ended up as slaves, was freed from slavery, wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, went through a conquest, settled in the land in tribes, separate tribes that were ruled by local judges, still not firmly established, finally gets a king so they can be like other nations. We have some issues there. David comes up as a great promised king, but now through Solomon, they are finally established. So Solomon will build up Jerusalem. As David established Jerusalem by pitching a tent, Solomon builds a temple. So they'll have a city. He'll build walls around the city. It'll be fortified. It'll have a political center. It'll have a religious center. And Israel will prosper as one great and grand nation. And as during this time, really the time of Solomon, where Israel becomes a major player in the world scene, other kingdoms and nations flow into Jerusalem to hear from Solomon. It really is between David and now Solomon the golden age of Israel. What started out as one individual in a nomadic tribe, had a God working for them and has now established them as this great and grand nation. So that's what's going on here. So good times right now in Israel. Great time to be alive. Those at the beginning of Solomon's reign experienced the greatest times of Israel. And so we don't take that for granted, that, when everything is done as Yahweh had said, there's prosperity. So Solomon starts out great. He's seeking wisdom. He's doing the right things. He loves God. He's following in the good ways of his father David. He's building a place for God. And as God promised, when you do that, everything goes well. So the people are growing. They become as the sand of the sea, as numerous as the sand of the sea. And the construction of the temple is done. God miraculously and powerfully fills the temple, as we'll see next week. And things are going well. Things are going well. So the centerpiece of Solomon's reign here is obviously the temple. The temple, beginning in verse 5 with the preparation, going into which God fills it, is told in lots of detail, while the many long years of Solomon's reign politically are merely summarized on either side of it. So the focal point just like the focal point in David's reign was his covenant with God, the focal point here in Solomon's reign is the temple. So with the exception of chapter 11, this unit recounts the glorious side of Solomon's kingdom. The unit is marked by his great building activities. There are 2 appearances of God directly to Solomon. The early stages of his reign were marked with wisdom, love, and obedience. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the instructions given to him by his father David, except he offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places, which was rectified when the temple was built. So these next chapters, from chapter 3 right up to chapter 11 things start to go bad, is prosperity, wisdom, love, obedience, blessing upon Solomon, and thus blessing upon Israel. So beginning chapters 3 through 5, there are 3 themes in chapters 3 through 5. Solomon's wisdom in chapter 3, the blessings of Solomon's rule in chapter 4, and the preparations to build the temple in chapter 5. So in chapter 3, we come to probably what most people in church know about Solomon mostly, and that is through Solomon's wisdom. Of course, much of the book of Proverbs is written by Solomon. We're told that there are many, many wise sayings and proverbs written by Solomon. There's many songs that are written by Solomon. Solomon is heralded first and foremost for his great wisdom. And it begins when Yahweh, the proper name of God, comes to Solomon in a dream and basically says, I'll give you whatever you request. We would all love to have that dream tonight, wouldn't we? God says, I'll give you anything you want. Recognizing his own inexperience and immaturity, Solomon asked for wisdom and the ability to know the difference between good and evil. And this request thrilled God. He not only gives Solomon an unparalleled mind and unparalleled wisdom above all the wisest people in the world at the time, but he gives Solomon everything he didn't ask for: riches, honor, and a long life. He says, because you didn't ask for riches, I'm going to give you riches. Because you didn't ask for honor and a long life, I'm going to give you that as well, provided that he remains faithful to keeping covenant with God, keeping God's law. As soon as Solomon wakes from his dream, God's wisdom is put to the test. The wisdom he received from God is put to the test. And this is a familiar story if we've been in church for a while. There is a custody battle between 2 prostitutes that now Solomon has to judge between. Quickly, Solomon realizes this case is just one woman's word against another. He can never prove who is telling the truth based upon their testimony. Maury Povich and his DNA test had not come, yet. That would come many years later. So it's no, you are not the mother, you are the mother. So none of that yet. So in wisdom, Solomon has an idea. Knowing a mother's love for a child and that a mother will do anything to save a child's life, he threatens to split the baby in half. All right, you both claim to be the mother? Great. Half of the baby will go to you. Half of the baby will go to you. Bring me my sword. And he says this knowing that the real mother would never allow this to happen to her baby. That's in 327. And in that moment, it's apparent that God has granted Solomon's request for wisdom. For the real mother would say, just let her have the baby. Don't kill this child. And in that moment, it's apparent that God has granted Solomon's request for wisdom. He's wisely able to determine good from evil and bring justice to bear. And because of this instance, because of this wisdom, fame spreads to all of Israel, and really to all over the world, to Israel and all over the world. So in chapter 4, the first part of chapter 4, we have describing of Solomon's kingdom, so we have a list of names. We all love lists of names in the Bible. So if you think these 19 verses are fun, just wait till the first 9 chapters of the book of 1 Chronicles. You can't wait for that. But we have Solomon's chief officials here. We have the royal household here. So chapter 4 is Solomon's court, if you will. Then if you notice in chapter 4 down in verse number 20, the people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. That's an allusion back to God's promise to Abraham, that your offspring will be as the number of the sand of the sea and of the stars of heaven. So Israel's prosperity, fulfilling covenant that God made, is shown here. And they ate and they drank and they were happy. Good times all around in Israel. And Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. So you see his borders as territory. These countries brought tribute and were Solomon's subjects all his life. Solomon's daily provision were 30 cores, or about 5.5 tons of the finest flour, 60 cores, or 11 tons of meal grain, 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep and goats, deer, gazelles, roebucks, choice of fowl. He ruled over all the kingdoms west of the Euphrates River, the tips of the Gaza, and had peace on all sides. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel from Dan to Beersheba lived in safety, everyone under their own vine and their own fig tree. Solomon had 4,000 stalls of chariot horses and 12,000 horses. The district governors, each in his month, supplied provisions for King Solomon and all who ate at the table. They saw to it that nothing was lacking. They brought their proper place, their quotas of barley and straw and chariots for the chariot horses and for the other horses. So basically all of that was listing how much prosperity that came to Solomon under his rule. So along with the provisions and the prosperity, verse 29 of chapter 4 says God gave Solomon wisdom. The breadth of his understanding was as measureless as the sand of the seashore. So not only were the people prospering, but Solomon himself was prospering. His wisdom, and then it goes on to list how great his wisdom was. His wisdom was greater than all the wisdom of the people of the east, greater than the wisdom of Egypt, wiser than anyone else, including some wise people that they obviously knew way back then. He spoke, verse 32, 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005 songs. Verse 33, then he spoke about plant life. He became a botanist? Is that what it is? He became a, professional botanist, knowing all about plants, from the cedars of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He spoke about animals. He became an expert in animals and birds and reptiles and fish. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who heard of his wisdom. So that's how wise Solomon was. He became a walking Google, a walking encyclopedia, knowing everything, having great wisdom and understanding. So this chapter is meant to provide how great Solomon was, how great the kingdom was, how much the kingdom prospered under Solomon. So chapter 4 is just bragging, all right? So that's just bragging. Then chapter 5, we have Solomon to set his eye to build the temple. And so this is obviously leading up to the culmination. All of Solomon's wisdom and everything was great, but it's in 1 Kings, it's all about the temple. So we'll spend many chapters. We spent one chapter bragging on Solomon and his great wisdom and great provisions. We'll spend the next several chapters talking about the temple. So chapter 5 begins with Solomon going to the king of Tyre, who heard that Solomon had been anointed king to succeed his father David. There was a good relationship there. The king of Tyre was friendly with David. So Solomon sends a message to him, and here's what the message read from Solomon to the king of Tyre. You know that because of wars waged against my father David from all sides, he could not build a temple in the name of the Lord, Yahweh his God, until Yahweh put his enemies under his feet. Now my Lord God has given me rest on every side, and there's no adversary or disaster. I intend therefore to build a temple for the name of the Lord, Yahweh my God, as the Lord told my father David when he said, your son, whom I shall put on the throne, in your place will build the temple in my name. So give orders, he's asking this to the king of Tyre now, so give orders that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me. My men will work with yours, and I will pay you for your men whatever wages you set. You know that we have no one skilled in felling timber as the Sidonians. When Hiram heard Solomon's message, he was greatly pleased and said, praise be to Yahweh today, for he has given David his wise son to rule over his great nation. So he sent word back to Solomon, I have received the message you sent me, and will do all that you want in providing cedar and juniper logs. My men will haul them down from Lebanon to the Mediterranean Sea. I will float them by rafts by sea to the place you specify. There I will separate them, and you can take them away. And you are to grant my wish by providing food for my royal household. And so this happens, and so the provisions are made to provide for the building of the temple. And then it goes on the rest of that to tell about the laborers and all of the men and the carriers and the stone cutters and the foremen and the supervisors and everybody who was tasked to lead this job of gathering the materials to build the tabernacle. So it took a lot of people to build this tabernacle, and workers and craftsmen and stone cutters and all kinds of people. So this is Solomon in his prosperity, in his fame, finding favor to build the temple. So right now, everything is great in Israel. Solomon is faithful. God is blessing. He is providing. The kingdom of David, the throne of David is established. And we'll see next week Solomon's greatest achievement in building God's temple and how beautiful and massive this temple will be.